Most people go to sleep thinking they're resting. They're not. In the last few minutes before you fall asleep, your brain is still working, still filtering, still deciding what matters, still shaping how you will feel tomorrow. And if you don't control that moment, it starts quietly controlling you. You don't just fall asleep. You carry something into sleep with you, a thought, a feeling, a sentence you repeat when everything else goes silent. And what you focus on in those final moments doesn't just disappear. It gets organized, reinforced, and often becomes the emotional starting point of your next day. Not because it's magic, but because your brain is paying attention. Research from Harvard Medical School shows that your brain continues processing emotional experiences during sleep. Studies published in Nature Reviews Neuroscience explain how memory consolidation strengthens recent thoughts and feelings. In simple terms, your mind doesn't just rest. It organizes what felt important, and what feels important is often what you repeated right before sleep. Think about your own nights for a second. The moment when the lights are off, your phone is down, and there's nothing left to distract you. What shows up in your mind? For most people, it's not calm. It's unfinished thoughts, small regrets, quiet worries about tomorrow. And if those thoughts repeat often enough, they don't stay in the night. They start showing up in your behavior, your mood, and the way you see yourself. I remember a friend of mine, let's call him Mike. During the day, he was capable, focused, even confident. But at night, everything shifted. He would lie in bed and replay the smallest details. A conversation that didn't feel quite right, a task that wasn't done perfectly. Something someone said that stayed with him longer than it should have. Nothing major, nothing dramatic, but he kept repeating it. Night after night, the same pattern. And slowly, something changed. Not overnight, not in an obvious way. But over time, he started waking up feeling heavier, less certain, less sharp. His mornings felt slower. His confidence dropped in ways he couldn't explain. His days hadn't changed much, but his nights had been shaping something quietly in the background. That's what makes this so important. We spend so much time trying to fix our lives during the day, our routines, our habits, our productivity. But we ignore the small window at night where your mind becomes quieter, more open, and in many ways more impressionable. This isn't about forcing yourself to think positive. It's not about ignoring real problems or pretending everything is fine. It's about becoming aware of what you're feeding your mind at the exact moment it's most receptive, because that moment matters more than you think. And by the end of this video, you'll have a simple, realistic way to reset your mind in just a few minutes before sleep, something you can actually do tonight. So don't rush this. Just listen. Let it land. And think about your own nights, the thoughts you carry, the patterns you've repeated without noticing, the quiet moments that might be shaping more than you realize. If this resonates with you, and you know someone who's been trying to improve their life during the day but keeps struggling at night, send this video to them tonight. It might be the small shift they didn't know they needed. Chapter 1. The last 10 minutes matter. That moment we talked about earlier, the one right before you fall asleep, most people miss it completely, not because it's hidden, but because it feels too ordinary to matter. You lie down, the lights go off, the day is over, and for the first time in hours, there's nothing demanding your attention, no notifications, no conversations, no tasks, just you, and whatever your mind decides to bring up. And if you're like most people, you don't choose those thoughts, you just follow them. A memory shows up, a small mistake, a conversation that didn't feel quite right, and before you realize it, you're replaying it, adjusting it, questioning it, rewriting it in ways that feel slightly better or slightly worse. It seems harmless, just thinking. But this is where it starts to matter, because your brain doesn't treat that moment as casual. It treats it as a signal of what deserves attention, a signal of what should be remembered, a signal of what might matter tomorrow. And the more emotionally charged the thought is, the stronger that signal becomes. That's why the same kinds of thoughts tend to show up at night. Not because your life is falling apart, but because your brain is trying to process what felt unresolved. The problem is, it doesn't always process it in a helpful way. It just repeats it. And what repeats strengthens. Your brain doesn't see overthinking as a problem. It sees it as a priority. That's the shift most people never make. They assume their thoughts are reacting to their life, but often their life starts reacting to their thoughts. I saw this play out in someone I worked with a few years ago. Her name was Emily. During the day, she was exactly the kind of person you'd trust with anything: organized, thoughtful, reliable. The kind of person who didn't need to prove herself because her work already did that. If something needed to be handled, she handled it, calmly, efficiently, quietly. But one night, after a long project, we ended up talking later than usual. The kind of conversation that only happens when the pressure of the day is finally gone. That's when she said something that stuck with me. She said, "I feel like I'm two different people." I asked her what she meant. She hesitated for a moment, then said, "During the day, I'm fine. I know what I'm doing. But at night, I start questioning everything. Not big things, small ones. An email that could have been clearer. A moment in a meeting where she paused too long. A decision she replayed hours later, wondering if there was a better option. Nothing anyone else noticed. But she noticed. And more importantly, she repeated it. Every night. At first it sounded like something everyone does, and in a way it is. But the pattern didn't stay contained to those quiet moments. It started showing up in her days. She became more cautious, more hesitant, less willing to speak unless she was completely certain. Not because she lacked ability, but because she had trained her mind to focus on what might be wrong. And once that becomes your pattern, it doesn't stay in one part of your life. It spreads. That's the part people underestimate. We think change comes from big decisions, big actions, big turning points. But a lot of it comes from what you quietly repeat when no one is watching, especially when you're not aware you're doing it. Because your brain doesn't stop and evaluate your thoughts the way you think it does. It doesn't ask, "Is this useful?" It doesn't ask, "Is this accurate?" It notices what you return to. It notices what you feel, and it builds around that. So when you lie in bed and replay everything that felt slightly off, your brain doesn't label that as overthinking. It labels it as important, and what feels important gets reinforced. It becomes easier to access, faster to trigger, more automatic the next time. That's why you can wake up feeling off without a clear reason. Nothing bad happened, but something got strengthened, and once you see it that way, those last 10 minutes stop feeling neutral. They become directional. They quietly decide what your mind leans toward the next day. Emily didn't realize this at first. She thought the solution was to stop thinking, to distract herself, to fall asleep faster so she wouldn't have to deal with it, but that never worked. Because the issue wasn't that she was thinking, it was what she kept returning to and reinforcing. The shift didn't come from forcing positive thoughts. It came from interrupting the pattern. One night, instead of asking, "What did I do wrong today?" she tried something different. Not dramatic, not even confident, just different. She asked, "What did I handle better than I think I did?" At first her mind resisted. There was a pause, because it wasn't used to looking there. But eventually, something came up. A small moment she had overlooked, something she dismissed earlier because it didn't feel significant. But she stayed with it. And that did something subtle. It didn't erase the negative thoughts. It didn't suddenly make her confident, but it changed the direction. And that's where everything starts, not with control, but with direction. Over time, that small shift began to compound. The nights felt lighter, the thoughts didn't spiral as far. And slowly her days started to reflect that change. She spoke up more. She hesitated less. She trusted herself a little more. Not because her life suddenly improved, but because she stopped reinforcing the same doubts every night. And that's the real point. You don't need to control every thought. You just need to notice what you keep repeating and decide whether it's worth strengthening. Because whether you realize it or not, those last 10 minutes are not empty. They're shaping something quietly, consistently. And once you understand why your brain tends to drift towards certain thoughts at night, you'll start to see why it so often leans negative in the first place. Study Chapter 2. Why your mind turns against you. At night, there's a reason your thoughts feel different at night. It's not random. It's not because your life suddenly becomes worse at 11 p.m. It's because something changes when everything gets quiet. During the day, your mind is occupied. You're solving problems, responding to people, moving from one task to the next. There's structure. There's momentum. Even if something bothers you, it gets pushed aside because something else demands your attention. But at night, that structure disappears. And when it does, your mind doesn't suddenly become peaceful. It starts searching. Not for what's going well, but for what's unfinished. That's the part most people misunderstand. Your brain isn't trying to make you feel bad. It's trying to resolve what feels incomplete. The problem is, it doesn't always resolve it. It replays it. And when something gets replayed without resolution, it starts to feel bigger than it actually is. That's why a small moment from earlier in the day can feel heavier at night than it ever did in real time. A sentence you barely noticed at 2 p.m. suddenly feels loaded at 11 p.m. A hesitation in a meeting becomes a sign that you're not good enough. A delayed reply turns into a story about being ignored. Nothing changed externally, but internally the meaning expanded. And this is where it becomes a problem, because your brain has a built-in bias. It doesn't scan for balance, it scans for risk. Psychologists call this negativity bias. Your mind is wired to prioritize potential problems over neutral or positive experiences, because from a survival perspective, missing a threat is more costly than missing something good. That made sense thousands of years ago, but in your day-to-day life now, it creates a distortion. At night, when your brain is left alone with no input, it defaults to that bias. It looks for what could be wrong, and once it finds something, it stays there. It circles it, replays it, expands it, and the more you engage with it, the more real it feels. That's why the thoughts you have at night don't just feel like thoughts. They feel like conclusions. I messed that up. They probably think less of me. I'm falling behind. And here's the dangerous part. It feels true. Not because it is, but because you've repeated it enough in a quiet environment where nothing challenges it. I saw this happen with someone I used to work with. His name was Daniel. Daniel wasn't insecure, at least not in the way people usually define it. He was competent, respected, and good at what he did. People relied on him. But every night his mind followed the same pattern. He would think about one moment from the day, usually something small, a comment he made in a meeting, a message he sent that didn't get an immediate reply, a decision that in hindsight could have been slightly better. And instead of letting it pass, he would stay with it. He'd replay it from different angles, imagine how it might have sounded to someone else. Think about what he should have said instead. At first it felt like reflection, like he was trying to improve, but over time it stopped being useful, because he wasn't resolving anything, he was reinforcing doubt, and slowly that pattern started showing up during the day. He hesitated more before speaking. He over-prepared for simple tasks. He second-guessed decisions that used to feel easy, not because he lacked skill, but because his brain had learned something at night. It had learned that small imperfections deserved attention, and once your brain learns that, it doesn't stay in one place. It spreads. That's how a 10-minute thought loop turns into a personality shift. And the hardest part is, it feels responsible. It feels like you're being careful, thoughtful, self-aware. But there's a difference between awareness and rumination. Awareness leads to clarity. Rumination leads to repetition. And repetition, especially at night, turns into identity. Because your brain doesn't separate just thinking from this matters. If you keep returning to the same doubt, it starts to feel like a pattern. And patterns become beliefs. I always overthink. I'm not confident. I'm not as good as I thought. Not because those statements are objectively true, but because they've been practiced, quietly, repeatedly, without interruption. And once a thought becomes familiar, your brain stops questioning it. It accepts it. That's why nighttime thinking is so powerful. Not because it's dramatic, but because it's unchallenged. During the day, your thoughts compete with reality, with other people, with feedback. At night, they don't. They expand freely. And whatever expands consistently starts to shape how you feel the next day. That's why you can wake up already feeling off. Not because something happened in the morning, but because something was reinforced the night before. And once you see this clearly, something shifts. You stop asking, why do I feel like this? And you start asking, what did I repeat last night? Because that's usually where the answer is. Daniel didn't realize this at first. He thought the solution was to think more carefully, to analyze better, to figure things out before going to sleep. But that only made the loop stronger. The shift came when he noticed something simple. The thoughts weren't solving anything. They were just repeating, and once he saw that, he stopped treating them as answers. He started treating them as patterns, and that changed how he responded. He didn't try to eliminate the thoughts. He just stopped following them as far. When a thought showed up, he noticed it, acknowledged it, and instead of expanding it, he let it stay small. That didn't feel natural at first, because his brain was used to going deeper. But over time, something changed. The thoughts didn't disappear, but they lost their weight. And once they lost their weight, they stopped shaping his mornings the same way. That's the real shift. not controlling your mind, but understanding what it does when you're not paying attention. Because once you understand why your brain drifts toward negative loops at night, you can start to see that those thoughts aren't instructions, they're habits, and habits can be changed. Chapter 3. The Identity You Repeat. At some point, it stops being about your thoughts. It becomes about who you think you are, not in a loud, obvious way. Not in a way where you sit down and say, "This is my identity now." It happens quietly, through repetition, through patterns that feel small, harmless, even logical. But over time, those patterns stop feeling like thoughts. They start feeling like truth. And once something feels true long enough, you stop questioning it. That's where the real shift happens. Not when your life changes, but when your internal narrative settles into something you accept. Because your brain doesn't just store thoughts, it builds consistency. If you think something once, it's just a thought. If you think it repeatedly, it becomes familiar. And if it becomes familiar enough, it starts to feel like you. That's how identity forms, not through big decisions, but through small repetitions that go unchallenged. And the reason this matters so much at night is because that's when repetition happens the cleanest. No interruptions, no competing input, no one there to offer a different perspective, just you, reinforcing whatever you keep returning to. I saw this in a way that was almost unsettling with someone I was close to. His name was Alex. If you met him during the day, you wouldn't question his confidence. He was sharp, articulate, and calm under pressure, the kind of person who didn't need to speak often to be taken seriously. But behind that, there was a pattern he never talked about. At night, his mind followed a very specific loop. It didn't jump randomly between thoughts. It returned to the same conclusion. I'm not as capable as people think I am. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly. And the strange part is, if you asked him during the day, he wouldn't say that out loud. He would probably disagree with it. But at night, when everything slowed down, that thought felt more believable. Not because it was proven, but because it was repeated. And repetition has a way of removing resistance. At first, it showed up as a thought. Then it became a question. Am I actually as good as they think? Then it became a pattern. Looking for evidence, noticing small mistakes, filtering out anything that didn't fit that narrative. And eventually, it became a lens. Everything started passing through it. Success felt like luck. Mistakes felt like confirmation. Neutral moments leaned negative. Nothing about his actual ability changed, but his perception did. And once perception shifts, behavior follows. He started over-preparing for things he already knew how to do. He hesitated before speaking, even when he had something valuable to say. He double-checked decisions that used to feel natural, not because he lacked skill, but because he had slowly accepted a version of himself that didn't match reality. And this is where it gets uncomfortable, because it raises a question most people avoid. What if the way you see yourself isn't based on truth? What if it's based on repetition? Because if that's the case, then a lot of what feels real about you might just be practiced, not chosen, not examined, just reinforced. And the dangerous part is, it feels earned. It feels like insight, like you've figured something out about yourself. But in reality, you may have just repeated the same thought enough times that it stopped feeling like a thought. It became a belief. Alex didn't notice when that shift happened. Most people don't, because it doesn't come with a clear moment. It builds quietly, night after night, until one day it's just there, and you act accordingly. That's how identity locks in. Not through one big decision, but through consistency your brain never questions. And here's the twist most people don't expect. Your brain isn't trying to define who you are. It's trying to stay consistent with what you've already shown it. That's it. It doesn't care if the pattern is helpful or limiting. It cares if it's familiar, because familiarity feels safe. So if you repeatedly think, "I'm not confident," your brain doesn't challenge that. It looks for ways to stay aligned with it. It nudges your behavior in that direction. It filters your experiences through that lens, not to sabotage you, but to stay consistent. And once you understand that, something shifts. You stop trying to fix yourself, and you start questioning what you've been repeating. Because the goal isn't to force a new identity overnight. That never works. The goal is to notice which thoughts are being practiced, and whether they're worth continuing. Alex's shift didn't come from a breakthrough moment. It came from something much simpler. One night he caught the thought, "I'm not as capable as people think I am." And instead of following it, analyzing it or trying to disprove it. He paused, and he asked a different question. What evidence am I ignoring? Not in a forced positive way, just honestly. And for the first time his mind didn't immediately go back to the same loop. It hesitated, because it wasn't used to that direction. But in that hesitation something opened. He remembered moments he had dismissed, decisions he made well, situations he handled calmly. Things that didn't fit the old narrative, and that didn't instantly change how he felt, but it disrupted the pattern, and that's where identity starts to loosen. Not when you replace a belief, but when you stop feeding it automatically. Over time, that small interruption started to matter. The thought still showed up, but it didn't land the same way. It didn't carry the same weight. And eventually, it stopped being the default, not because he forced confidence, but because he stopped reinforcing doubt. That's the shift. You don't become someone new by declaring it. You become someone new by changing what you repeatedly return to. Because identity isn't something you discover. It's something you practice, quietly, consistently, often without realizing it. And once you see that clearly, a new question shows up. If your thoughts can turn into patterns, and patterns can turn into identity, then what exactly are you becoming every night? Chapter 4. The shift that doesn't look like a shift. Most people expect change to feel obvious, like a clear decision, a strong moment, a point where everything suddenly clicks. But that's not how it usually happens. The real shift is quieter than that. It doesn't feel like transformation. It feels like hesitation, a pause you didn't have before, a moment where your mind doesn't go exactly where it used to. And if you're not paying attention, you'll miss it completely. Because it doesn't look like progress. It looks like nothing. I remember a time in my own life when everything on the outside looked stable, but internally, something felt off. Not broken, not dramatic, just slightly misaligned. I was doing what I was supposed to do. Showing up, getting things done, staying consistent. From the outside, there was no reason to question anything. But at night, the same pattern kept showing up. It wasn't loud. It didn't come in the form of panic or anxiety. It was quieter than that. A subtle sense that something wasn't enough. Not enough progress, not enough clarity, not enough certainty about where things were going. And the more I thought about it, the more it felt true. Not because I had evidence, but because I kept returning to it. That's how it works. A thought doesn't need proof if it has repetition. And repetition doesn't feel like influence. It feels like confirmation. That's the trap. You don't realize you're reinforcing something. You think you're discovering it. That was the twist I didn't see coming. I thought I was being honest with myself, reflective, aware, even disciplined. But what I was actually doing was narrowing my perception, looking at the same angle over and over again until it felt like the only angle that existed. And the more I stayed there, the more everything started to align with it. Small wins didn't feel meaningful. Progress felt slow, even when it wasn't. Neutral moments leaned negative. Not because reality changed, but because my filter did. And once your filter changes, your experience follows. That's when it started to affect how I showed up. Nothing dramatic, just subtle shifts. I hesitated a little more before making decisions. I second-guessed things that used to feel simple. I started measuring myself against an invisible standard I couldn't even define. And the strange part is, I didn't question it. Because it felt like clarity. It felt like I was seeing things for what they are. But I wasn't. I was seeing things through repetition. And repetition can feel a lot like truth. The shift didn't happen when I tried to fix it. It didn't happen when I tried to think more positively or force a better mindset. It happened on a night that felt completely ordinary. Nothing special about it. I was lying in bed, going through the same pattern, replaying the day, noticing what felt incomplete, letting that quiet sense of not enough build in the background. And then something different happened. Not a breakthrough, just a pause, a small interruption in the pattern. Instead of following the thought, I noticed it, not analyzed it, not argued with it, just noticed it, and for a moment, it lost its momentum. That's when I saw something I hadn't seen before. The thought didn't come with evidence. It came with familiarity. It wasn't true. It was practiced. That was the shift. Not realizing something new, but realizing that what felt true might just be repeated. And once that clicks, something changes, not externally, but internally. You stop treating every thought like information. And you start seeing it as a pattern, and patterns can be interrupted. That night, I didn't try to replace the thought. I didn't force anything positive. I just didn't continue it. And that felt uncomfortable, because your brain expects completion. It wants to follow the loop, close it, finish it, resolve it, but when you don't, it leaves something open. And that openness is where change starts. The next night the thought came back. Of course it did. Patterns don't disappear just because you notice them once, but it felt different. It didn't pull as strongly. There was a small gap between the thought and my reaction to it, and that gap is everything, because in that gap you have a choice. Not a big dramatic choice, a small one. Do you follow the pattern, or do you let it pass? Most people never see that gap. They move from thought to reaction instantly. And over time that becomes automatic. But once you see it, even once, you can't unsee it, and that's when the real shift begins. Not when you become a different person, but when you stop automatically becoming the same one. Over time, that small interruption started to change things, not quickly, not perfectly, but consistently. The thoughts still showed up, but they didn't define the direction anymore. And that changed how I showed up during the day. I wasn't lighter because my life improved. I was lighter because I stopped reinforcing the same weight every night. That's the part no one tells you. Change doesn't always come from adding something new. Sometimes it comes from stopping something old. And stopping isn't dramatic, it's quiet, it's subtle, it's easy to overlook, but it matters more than most things you try to add. Because as long as you keep reinforcing the same pattern, nothing new has space to grow. And once you stop even slightly, even inconsistently, space opens. And in that space, something different can start to take shape. Not because you forced it, but because you finally stopped holding on to what was already there. That's the shift. It doesn't feel like transformation. It feels like less reaction, less attachment, less automatic repetition. And from that less, something new begins. And once you experience that, even briefly, a new question starts to form. If you don't have to follow every thought, if you don't have to reinforce every pattern, then what would happen if you became more intentional about what you allow to continue? Chapter 5. You don't need new thoughts. You need new permission. Most people think change comes from thinking something new, a better thought, a more positive belief, a stronger mindset. But that's not where it starts. Because if your mind doesn't believe the new thought, it won't stay. You can repeat something 100 times. I'm confident. I'm capable. I'm in control. But if it doesn't feel real, your brain quietly rejects it. Not loudly, not obviously, just subtly. It drifts back to what feels familiar. That's the part most people get wrong. They try to replace their thoughts without changing what their mind allows. And your mind doesn't run on logic. It runs on permission. What feels allowed, what feels acceptable, what feels like it belongs. That's what determines what stays. I saw this in a way that completely changed how I understood mindset with someone I used to train with. His name was Jordan. Jordan wasn't struggling with discipline. He showed up. He worked hard. He did everything people say you're supposed to do. But there was one thing that kept holding him back. Not his ability, not his effort, his ceiling. No matter how much progress he made, he would always stop at the same point. Push forward, then pull back. Improve, then stall. Build momentum, then lose it. At first it didn't make sense. From the outside it looked like inconsistency. But when you paid attention, it wasn't random. It was precise. He didn't fall apart everywhere, only when things started going well. That's where the pattern showed up. And one day after a session, we sat down and talked about it. I asked him a simple question. What happens right before you slow down? He didn't answer immediately. Then he said something that explained everything. It starts to feel uncomfortable. Not physically, mentally. Like he was stepping into something that didn't feel like him. More responsibility, more visibility, more expectation. And underneath all of that, something quieter. This isn't really me. That was the real limit, not his skill, his permission. Because every time he got close to a new level, his mind didn't say, this is progress. It said, this doesn't belong to you. And once something feels like it doesn't belong, you don't need to sabotage it. You just stop holding on to it. That's the twist most people never see. You don't always lose progress because you're weak. You lose it because it doesn't match what you believe you're allowed to have. Jordan didn't think he was holding himself back. He thought he just needed more discipline, more structure, more effort. But none of that addressed the real issue, because the problem wasn't what he was doing, it was what he believed he was allowed to keep. That's a different level of awareness. Because now you're not asking, what should I do? You're asking, what feels like it belongs to me? And if your internal answer is limited, your results will be too. Not because you can't go further, but because you won't stay there. That's how identity controls outcomes, not by blocking you, but by pulling you back to what feels familiar. Jordan's shift didn't come from trying harder. It came from noticing the moment things started to feel too much. Instead of pushing through it blindly, he paused, and he asked something different. Why does this feel unfamiliar? Not in a critical way, just with curiosity. And what came up wasn't about his current situation. It was older than that. Past experiences where stepping up came with pressure, moments where being seen meant being judged, times where success didn't feel safe. It felt exposed. That's what his mind had learned, not consciously, but through experience. So when he started growing beyond a certain point, his brain didn't interpret it as progress. It interpreted it as risk, and what feels like risk gets avoided. Not always dramatically, but consistently. That's why effort alone doesn't solve it, because effort pushes you forward. But identity decides where you stay, and if your identity doesn't expand with your progress, you keep resetting yourself. That's the loop. Jordan didn't try to fix that belief. He didn't force confidence. He didn't convince himself that everything was safe. He did something simpler. He started allowing small pieces of that new level to exist, without rejecting them, without minimizing them, without pulling back immediately. When something went well, he didn't brush it off. He stayed with it. When attention increased, he didn't retreat. He tolerated it, not comfortably, but intentionally. And that's where the shift began. Not in what he thought, but in what he allowed, because your mind doesn't expand all at once. It adjusts slowly, through repeated exposure to what once felt unfamiliar. Over time, what felt too much started to feel manageable, then normal, then expected. Not because he changed overnight, but because he stopped rejecting what didn't feel like him. And eventually, it did. That's the real change. You don't become someone new by thinking differently. You become someone new by allowing different things to exist, without pushing them away, because identity isn't built by force, it's built by tolerance. What you can tolerate consistently becomes what you can hold, and what you can hold becomes what you believe is yours. That's the shift most people skip. They try to jump straight to confidence. But confidence isn't the first step. Permission is. And once you give yourself permission, quietly, gradually, without forcing it, everything else starts to follow, not instantly, but inevitably. And that leads to a different kind of question. Not, how do I change my thoughts, but what am I still not allowing myself to have, even when I'm capable of it? Chapter 6. The quiet standard you live by. There's something most people never say out loud. Not because they're hiding it, but because they don't even realize it's there. It's the standard they quietly live by. Not the one they talk about. Not the one they post. Not the one they think they believe in. The real one. The one that shows up in their actions, especially when no one is watching. Because at the end of the day, you don't live by what you say matters. You live by what you tolerate, what you allow, what you accept, what you quietly decide is good enough. That's your real standard. And it doesn't reveal itself during the day when you're trying to be intentional. It reveals itself at night, when you stop performing, when you stop adjusting, when your mind goes back to default. That's where the truth is. I didn't fully understand this until I noticed it in someone I used to work with. Her name was Rachel. Rachel was driven, focused, the kind of person who had goals, plans, and a clear idea of what she wanted her life to look like. If you asked her what she valued, she had an answer. Growth, discipline, high standards. And during the day, it looked like that was true. She worked hard, stayed organized, pushed herself. But at night, something different showed up. Not in a dramatic way, in a quiet one. She would reflect on her day, not to understand it, but to judge it. What she didn't do, what she could have done better, where she fell short of her own expectations. And the strange part is, it didn't make her better. It made her tired, not physically, mentally. Because every night she was reinforcing the same message. It's not enough. Not directly, but consistently. And over time, that became her baseline. No matter what she achieved during the day, it got filtered through that standard. Finish something? Could have done it faster. Did well? Could have done it better. Made progress? Not enough yet. And here's the part that changed everything. She didn't see it as a problem. She saw it as discipline. That's the twist. Because a lot of what people call high standards is actually just self-rejection in disguise. It looks productive. It feels responsible. But underneath it, there's no sense of completion. No sense of this was enough for today. And without that, your mind never resets. It just keeps running. That's why the standard you live by matters more than the goals you set. Because your goals push you forward, but your standards decide how you feel while you're moving. Rachel wasn't stuck because she lacked ambition. She was stuck because nothing she did ever met her internal threshold. And when nothing meets your standard, your motivation slowly erodes. Not all at once, but quietly. Because your brain starts asking a simple question. What's the point? That's where burnout begins, not from doing too much, but from never feeling like what you do is enough. And the most dangerous part? It feels justified. Because your standard sounds good on paper. Be better. Do more. Don't settle. But if there's no room for acknowledgement, no moment where something is allowed to be complete, you're not building momentum. You're building resistance. Rachel didn't realize this at first. She thought she just needed to push harder. Raise her standards even more. Be more disciplined. But that only made the gap bigger. Because the issue wasn't effort. It was the definition of enough. The shift didn't come from lowering her standards. It came from redefining them. One night, instead of asking, "What did I not do well enough?" she tried something different. Not positive, not fake, just different. She asked, "What actually met my standard today?" At first, her mind resisted, because it wasn't used to looking there. It was trained to scan for gaps, not completion. But she stayed with it, and eventually something came up. A task she handled well, a decision she made clearly, a moment where she followed through. Small things, but real. And that did something subtle. It created a new reference point, not for perfection, but for completion. And once your mind has a reference for this counts, it starts to change how you experience your day. The next day, she noticed something. She still worked hard, still pushed herself, but there was less pressure behind it, because she wasn't chasing an undefined standard anymore. She was working towards something she could actually recognize. That's the difference. When your standard is vague, your mind never lands. When your standard is clear, your mind can settle, and that changes everything. Not externally, internally. Because now your effort has an endpoint, your day has a sense of closure, and your nights stop feeling like an endless review of what's missing. They start becoming a place where things are processed, and then released. That's the real function of reflection, not to criticize, but to integrate, to take what happened, understand it, and let it settle. But you can't do that if nothing ever feels complete. Rachel didn't become less driven, she became more stable, more consistent. Because she wasn't draining herself every night trying to meet a standard that didn't exist. She created one that did. And once she did, everything shifted. Not because she did more, but because she stopped invalidating what she had already done. That's the part most people miss. You don't need a higher standard. You need a clearer one. Because clarity creates consistency, and consistency builds identity. So the real question isn't, am I doing enough? It's, what actually counts, according to the standard I'm living by? Because whatever that answer is, that's the life you're reinforcing. Quietly, every single night. Chapter 7. What you feed your mind stays. There's a part of this most people don't want to admit because it feels small. Too small to matter. But it matters more than almost everything else we've talked about. It's not just what you think at night. It's what you bring with you into that moment. Because your thoughts don't appear out of nowhere. They come from what you've been consuming all day. What you watch, what you scroll through, what you listen to, what you compare yourself to without even realizing it. That becomes the raw material your mind uses at night. And when everything gets quiet, that material starts to surface, not randomly, predictably. That's the part most people miss. They think their night thoughts are just how they are, but a lot of it is input, accumulated, unfiltered, left to replay when there's nothing else to interrupt it. I saw this clearly with someone I knew. His name was Kevin. Kevin wasn't struggling with discipline. He worked, showed up, stayed consistent. But every night his mind followed the same pattern. comparison. Not obvious comparison. Subtle. The kind that doesn't feel like comparison. It feels like observation. He would scroll before bed. Not for long. Just enough to relax. A few videos, a few posts. People doing better, moving faster, achieving more. Nothing extreme. Just enough to plant a quiet thought. I'm behind. And that thought didn't feel like something he picked up. It felt like something he realized. That's the twist. Because when input turns into belief, it doesn't feel external anymore. It feels like truth. Kevin didn't think social media was affecting him. He thought he was just noticing reality. But reality wasn't the problem. The filter was. Because when you repeatedly expose your mind to a certain narrative, it starts to feel normal. Not accurate, normal. And what feels normal becomes the baseline you measure yourself against. So even when you're doing fine, it doesn't feel like it. Even when you're progressing, it feels slow. Even when nothing is wrong, something feels off. And at night, when everything slows down, that feeling expands, not because your life changed, but because your input has been shaping your expectations, and expectations shape perception. Kevin didn't realize this at first. He thought the solution was to be more disciplined at night, to think better. But every time he lay down, the same thoughts showed up. Because he wasn't changing the source, he was trying to control the result. That never works. You can't outthink what you keep feeding your mind, that's the reality. Because your brain doesn't just remember what you say to yourself. It remembers what you expose yourself to. And it uses that as reference. That's why your thoughts at night often don't feel chosen, they feel triggered, because they are. Triggered by everything you've absorbed throughout the day. And once you see that, something shifts. You stop asking, why am I thinking this? And you start asking, where did this come from? That question changes everything, because now you're not just reacting. You're tracing. Kevin's shift didn't come from quitting everything. He didn't delete every app. He didn't isolate himself from the world. He did something smaller. He started noticing what left a mark. Not what he consumed. What stayed with him. Because not everything affects you equally. Some things pass through, others stick. And the ones that stick show up later, usually at night. He noticed that certain types of content always led to the same feeling, not immediately, but later. A sense of pressure, comparison, subtle dissatisfaction. So, he made a small change. Not dramatic, just intentional. He stopped consuming anything that left him feeling less than before sleep. That's it. He didn't replace it with motivation. He didn't try to optimize it. He just removed what distorted his perception. And that created something he didn't expect. Silence. At first it felt uncomfortable, because his mind was used to noise, used to stimulation, used to having something to react to. But without that input, his thoughts started to slow down. Not disappear, just settle. And when they did, something became clear. A lot of what he thought were his thoughts weren't his. They were echoes of what he had been seeing, hearing, absorbing, all day. That's the twist. Your mind isn't always creating. It's reflecting. And if you don't control what you feed it, you end up living inside something you didn't consciously choose. Kevin didn't become more positive. He became more selective. And that changed everything. Because when you change your input, you change what shows up when nothing else is there. And that changes how your nights feel. Less heavy, less reactive, less crowded. Not because you fixed your thinking, but because you stopped overwhelming it. That's the shift. You don't need better thoughts. You need cleaner input, because your mind builds from what it's given, and whatever you feed it consistently becomes what it returns to automatically, especially at night. So the question isn't just, what am I thinking before sleep? It's, what have I been feeding my mind that's now thinking for me? Chapter 8. You become what you return to. There's a moment most people are waiting for. They don't always say it out loud, but it's there in the background. A moment where everything finally clicks, where they feel different, think differently, show up as a new version of themselves without effort, a shift, a breakthrough, something that changes everything at once. But that moment almost never comes the way people expect it, because change doesn't arrive all at once. It accumulates, quietly, through what you return to, again and again. That's the part people underestimate. You don't become a new person because of one decision. You become a new person because of what you consistently go back to, especially when no one is guiding you, especially at night. When there's no structure, no expectation, no external pressure, just you and whatever feels familiar. That's where identity stabilizes, not in what you try, but in what you return to. I saw this play out in someone I knew. His name was Marcus. Marcus didn't look like someone who was stuck. From the outside, everything seemed fine. He had a routine, a steady job, clear goals. He wasn't lost, but he wasn't moving forward either. He kept circling the same place, trying new things, getting motivated, starting again, but always returning to the same baseline. Not worse, not better, just the same. At first it looked like inconsistency, like he just needed more discipline, more structure. But that wasn't it, because Marcus didn't fail when things were hard. He slipped when things were quiet, at night, when the day ended and there was nothing left to do. That's when the pattern showed up. He would think about what he wanted to change, what he should be doing differently, how things needed to improve. And for a moment it felt clear, like he understood everything. But then he would drift back into the same thoughts, the same doubts, the same quiet assumptions about himself. I always fall off. I'm not consistent. This probably won't last. Not aggressively, not with emotion, just casually, like statements he had accepted a long time ago. And that's what shaped everything. Not his effort, not his goals, but what he kept returning to when nothing interrupted him. That's the pattern most people live inside without realizing it. They think their life is shaped by what they do, but it's shaped by what they default to. And your default doesn't show up when you're trying, it shows up when you stop. Marcus didn't see that at first. He thought he needed better habits, better systems, more discipline. But every time he built momentum, it would fade, because the moment things got quiet, he returned to the same internal baseline. And that baseline didn't support the version of himself he was trying to become. That's the twist. You don't fall back because you're weak. You fall back because you return to something familiar. And familiarity is stronger than intention, every time. The shift didn't come from adding more. It came from noticing where he returned to. One night, instead of thinking about what he needed to change, he paid attention to what his mind did automatically. No effort, no control, just observation. And he saw it clearly. The same thoughts. The same conclusions. The same quiet identity he had been reinforcing for years. I'm inconsistent. That one line explained everything. Because if that's what you return to, that's what you become. Not because it's true, but because it's repeated. And once something is repeated enough, your brain stops treating it like a possibility. It treats it like a rule. Marcus didn't try to argue with it. He didn't try to prove it wrong. He did something simpler. He stopped reinforcing it, not completely, not perfectly, but intentionally. When the thought showed up, he noticed it, and instead of continuing it, he paused. Not forcing a new belief, just not feeding the old one. That created something subtle, a gap. And in that gap, something else had space to exist. At first it felt empty, uncertain, because his mind wasn't used to that. It was used to completing the pattern, closing the loop, returning to the same conclusion. But without that completion, something changed. The thought lost its authority. It didn't disappear, but it didn't land the same way. And over time that mattered more than anything else, because what you return to starts to shift, slowly, almost invisibly. The old pattern weakens, not because you fought it, but because you stopped practicing it and a new one starts to form. Not because you forced it, but because there's finally space for it. That's how identity changes, not through intensity, through consistency, not what you try once, but what you return to repeatedly. Marcus didn't become a different person overnight. He didn't wake up with a new mindset. He just stopped going back to the same one, and that changed everything. Because now when things got quiet, his mind didn't automatically pull him backward. It stayed neutral, then gradually. It started moving forward, not dramatically, but steadily. And that's the shift people miss. You don't need to become someone new. You need to stop returning to who you've been. Because every night, whether you realize it or not, you're practicing something, a thought, a belief, a version of yourself. And whatever you practice, you become more comfortable being. That's the real question. Not who do I want to be, but who am I rehearsing every single night? because that's the version of you that's slowly becoming real. If you step back for a moment, you'll start to see the pattern. Nothing we talked about today was extreme. Nothing required a complete life overhaul. Nothing depended on motivation or willpower or some perfect version of you. It was quieter than that. It was about what happens in the moments most people ignore. The last few minutes before you fall asleep. The thoughts you return to when everything slows down. The patterns you repeat without questioning. Because that's where change actually begins. Not in what you say you want, but in what your mind keeps practicing. Throughout this video, we've looked at something simple, but powerful. Your brain doesn't just rest at night, it processes, it reinforces. It organizes what felt important, and what feels important is often what you repeat. We saw how those repeated thoughts don't stay as thoughts, they become patterns. Those patterns shape your identity, and that identity quietly influences how you show up the next day, not dramatically, but consistently. We talked about how your mind leans toward unresolved thoughts at night, how it turns small moments into conclusions, how it reinforces what feels familiar, even if it's limiting. We saw how identity isn't something you choose once, it's something you rehearse, night after night. We looked at the idea of permission. How you don't just think differently, you allow different things to exist. We talked about standards, not the ones you say you have, but the ones you actually live by. And we saw how what you feed your mind during the day becomes what shows up at night. And finally, we came back to something simple. You become what you return to, not what you try once, not what you hope for, but what you repeat when no one is watching. And that's the part that gives you control. Because if repetition is what shapes you, then small changes, done consistently, matter more than anything dramatic. So instead of trying to change everything at once, start here, tonight. Before you sleep, pause, not for long, just long enough to notice what your mind is doing. What thought is showing up? What are you about to repeat? And then gently shift it, not by forcing something fake, not by pretending everything is perfect, but by choosing something slightly more useful, something that doesn't pull you backward. It could be as simple as asking, what did I handle better than I think I did today? Or, what am I still learning instead of failing at? Small questions, but they change direction. And direction, repeated over time, becomes identity. You don't need to do it perfectly. You don't need to get it right every night. You just need to become aware and interrupt the pattern a little more often. Because that's how it starts. Quietly, subtly, but powerfully. If this message resonated with you, take a moment and think about someone in your life who might need to hear this. Someone who's trying to improve, but feels stuck. Someone who's carrying more in their mind than they show. Someone who keeps repeating the same thoughts. Without realizing it, share this video with them. Not later. Tonight, it might be the small shift they didn't know they needed. And if you made it this far, I appreciate you. Not just for watching, but for paying attention. Because most people don't. And that alone already sets you apart. We'll continue building on this in the next video. Until then, take care of your mind, especially in the moments when it feels the quietest.